Hey Tegan, what's in the bag? It's the show where I come home from the comic book store and we look through my bag of comics because, say it with me folks, yes, I buy too many comics. If you like this show, if you like any of my shows, if you want to support my frankly deleterious comic book habit, visit my Patreon. That's how you can show your appreciation for what I do. I got tons of stuff there for you to download right this second. But now we're in it to win it with the Gotham City Sirens. At this point, you're probably sick of hearing me go on about the Harley Quinn corner of the DC Universe. I'm sorry, it's the most interesting place in the Big Two, just about. In terms of the consistent level of quality art they get, even just for the regular Harley Quinn, Poison Ivy books. I haven't been quite as enamored with Catwoman lately, but I bet, most Catwoman comics aren't that good, but it takes a whole lot to keep them from being bad, as long as Catwoman is in them. That's my philosophy on the matter. So yeah, covered by Terry Dodson. Man, I've been buying comic books for Terry Dodson since the Clinton administration. That's how long he's been around, and that's how long his stuff has been, worth looking at as probably the most bald-faced interpreter of Adam Hughes, shall we say. But straight up, half, maybe 2/3 on a good day of Adam Hughes is still like, man, that takes a remarkable amount of talent right there just to get to that level. Anyway, do people buy the toy covers? Because both companies do these toy package covers in here. I don't know if this is the first time they've done these, but I've seen these on the shelves this month, and they catch your eye at least because they're superpower cards, composed of cards for characters who weren't part of the original Secret Wars line. Like, they never had a shirtless Batman. They certainly never had a Nightwing. Nightwing premiered, I think, during the lifetime of the Superpowers TV show. He was a new quantity. Kid Flash, I don't think he made it to the show. Poison Ivy just wasn't getting a figure in 1984. So yeah, they're Jon Stewart. Nice looking, but are you going to buy that for a comic book cover, or is this like a something on an old blog post that goes semi-viral on the blogosphere? But apparently there's enough juice in just the Superpowers branding that Todd McFarlane certainly thinks that it is a profitable product line, because he's putting a lot of Superpower stuff on the market, which is a weird concatenation of words to string together in 2024. But there you have it, folks. Todd McFarlane's in the Superpowers business. So yeah, I think, as a rule, the distaff books in the Batman family tend to have the highest standard of art across the comic book industry. It's just something it's not based on a supposition. It's based on empirical observation over the last 25 years, pretty much since the end of Jim Balent, when they brought in Darwin Cook and that crew to renew the Catwoman character. They were getting away from overt cheesecake for a while in the mid-2000s. That stuff, that was a weird era in general. And then the cheesecake stuff, which we should just put it right out there, is a huge part of the success of these books, you know, thinking back to the first Gotham City Sirens and the first Gotham City Sirens series. It's not just that it had the Guillaume March art, but it was also written by Paul Dini. He was one of the Batman the Animated Series guys, and he, you know, matriculated from that into, you know, writing a fair pile of, you know, Batman comics just on his own later on, some of which were pretty good. I think they just put out an omnibus of some of the comic books he wrote, so he certainly had a few substantial runs. And one of the things that he did was the first volume of that Gotham City Sirens book. So it's got a pedigree, because certainly the animated series was quite upfront in its sexuality, which is an odd thing to say about a cartoon from the early 1990s. And yet, there's no question. I don't think their version of Catwoman really caught on necessarily, because you know, the Michelle Pfeiffer one was so recent, and it was so indelible. Even if a lot of it's idiosyncratic, of course, but it's, you know, become recognized as a classic. So the animated series didn't really seem like they had too much to say to her, other than a nod at sort of a streamlined, you know, Bronze Age Catwoman. So there was a lot more room for, you know, Poison Ivy, Harley Quinn to take over from the, you know, secondary sex pot position. And, you know, it's pretty widely accepted that, you know, part of the success of the, you know, Batman the Animated Series was the fact that it did have, you know, very little sex at the end of the day. What they had, what little they were allotted, was focused, like really focused. And it had an impression. You know, this character, that's where she's from. This version, I'm not going to say that this version of Poison Ivy was as definitive on the animated series, but she hadn't really been a presence on any previous adaptation, so it was her introduction to the world stage, as it were. And it was a few years after that that, you know, Uma Thurman was Poison Ivy in Batman and Robin, which I think is, you know, many people's favorite part of what is generally a controversial movie. Oh man, we're seeing last week's ads. I'm sorry. And the writer here is someone who I really want to pay attention to. Leah Williams. I've read a couple comics of hers that have really impressed me, particularly one series she did for Marvel a couple years ago called The Exterminators, which I thought was great. It was hilarious. It seemed to be trying to find a place in Marvel's X-Men line for something tonally really not far removed from, you know, a tone that seems to reside now more naturally with, you know, some of the female-fronted Batman books. You know, a bit of cheesecake up front, tongue-in-cheek, humor-tinted even, straight up. And I don't know, I thought Exterminators was great. I thought Exterminators was one of the best books I read in years. It was a funny book that was composed of characters making jokes at each other, but it wasn't grating, because it really felt like you were just overhearing a friend group bust on each other over the course of a very long week and, you know, violent weekend. Excellent series. I highly recommend it. And of course, no follow-up at all. I thought I would have hoped when I first read the first couple issues, I thought it was maybe an ongoing, but I was soon dispelled of that notion. And they haven't brought back either those creators or even those characters together as a unit. But man, I love that book. I would read a sequel. I would read a monthly with those characters and that tone. Again, it was great. And maybe if Leah Williams can do something like that with, you know, a set of characters who, the first time they were put together, the first volume of Gotham City Sirens, it was It wasn't a funny book. It maybe was a bit lighthearted because it had its tongue a bit in cheek. The stakes weren't quite so high. It actually dipped its toe a little tiny bit into, domestic environments. In terms of, we spent a good deal of time with the Riddler, I think, in his bathrobe, if I recall correctly. So just an interesting series that was ahead of its time in a few different ways. And if you look at that corner of DC, with the Cheesecake books, the tone, the look, that has slowly become recognized as a very, very commercial tone and look. This is the version of the character who they put in all the movies. And it was the one that was launched by Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Connor. They remade the character, and they kind of turned her into, a little bit of a Deadpool clone in some respects, but it gave her some energy and some life. And the fact is that she was a fan favorite, but kind of like Deadpool. She was really big in the early 90s, and then for some reason they dragged their feet about putting her in the actual comic books or doing anything with him in, Deadpool's case. By the time they got around to it, there was barely enough spark of appeal to launch a low-selling, fan favorite book. But it was enough, and eventually, as with Deadpool, they found a hook that really hit commercially. Anyway, by now, you know the deal. I like Harley Quinn. I think that her books were some of the best things from DC in years where I was struggling to find DC books to actually enjoy. Her books were always readable, sometimes very good, and the art was uniformly superlative. And that version of the character went on to be pretty darn significant, I would say. So this is the first iteration of the Sirens with that version of the character, because the previous one, the first Gotham City Sirens, that more or less had the final iteration of Dini's understanding of the character as he co-created her. And then she started dressing differently and showing her hair. Someone is just being quite spunky. I have had to abandon recording, restart a number of times tonight because someone... That's not a bad looking Wonder Woman. What always gets me, though, is that the accessories end up... Oh, is this a statue? Oh, these are statues. There you go. That'll probably come out looking better. I spent some time, oddly enough, playing with statues at the store recently, putting a number of them together just for fun one afternoon. They put together some really interesting looking statues. I don't know who has the money. I've never made... objectively, I spend too much money on comics, and I've never, ever felt justified in purchasing a statue. But it holds up a part of the industry all on its own, doesn't it? And Todd McFarlane does them too. All right. Part of me hates that I was a mark, to use the parlance. I walked into the store. I looked at the version that didn't have the red band, and then I asked the woman behind the register who talks to people who buy comic books all day, what's the consensus on these red bands? What are you missing? And she said basically just what was told to her in the context of people actually buying the comic books was that people like the red bands, and they were buying them. So, I'm sorry. I don't like it. It seems like the worst Spectre of the 1990s, somehow. And I don't know how they're going to sell this material when it's collected if this is the version you'll be able to buy in Barnes & Noble, because I'm certain they would like to have at least some sort of aftermarket life if they're putting Hickman and Capullo together. They want to have something, they can put on the bookshelf. Which version is it going to be? I don't know. It'll probably end up being this version, because apparently the other version just straight up doesn't have all the panels, which ultimately, that makes sense. I guess that's the only way you could really do it. So they got me. I paid $1 more. $1 more. And you may be thinking, you are precisely the person P.T. Barnum warned us about. To which I can only say yes. Absolutely. Man, did they used to be? I'm thinking back to the last time I bought a comic book in a poly bag. Did they used to be such a devil? I don't know. Is the police gonna come and get me if I put this out over the open airwaves? Is that how extreme this is? No, I spent a lot of time recently watching Fist of the North Star. I'm just not thinking this is going to be too pulse pounding, but I don't know. It's not Quasar. Let's just get that out of the way. We all know, in a perfect world, his return to Marvel would be for Quasar. That run of comics, Greg Capullo on Quasar with Mark Grunwald, it's just about peerless, in my estimation. One of the most interesting, one of the most influential, surprisingly influential, but very influential runs of comic books from that period. It's the run of comic books that made Greg Capullo. This is a very weird run of wonky, research-heavy. What was I saying before I was so rudely interrupted? He has just had the devil in him lately. I had to quit recording the other night. I had it all set up to go. He wouldn't let me be. He goes through phases where his rascality just seems to double or treble, and then maybe he calms down a bit, but he doesn't like it when I record some nights. He just doesn't. And since we're here to talk about rascality, yes, Mark Grunwald wrote a remarkably weird series of comic books in Quasar for Greg Capullo to draw. There is a lot of body horror, like a massive, unacknowledged trove of body horror in Mark Grunwald's work, specifically that run of Quasar, which kills the main character. I think over the course of a year and a half, I think he died like 3 times. His body is torn apart, eviscerated. There are giant plant monsters. It's just a very odd run of comic books. In a lot of ways, it really challenges the young Greg Capullo. But I think after drawing Quasar from Mark Grunwald, Greg Capullo must feel like he can draw anything. When he got to X-Force, they were just like, oh, draw some X-Men doing stuff. Oh, okay. Huh. That's it? There's not going to be any, like, subtext? No, the X-Men have plenty of subtext on their own. That you don't need to worry about the subtext. It's already there. It arrived previous. Oh, they're doing a new Spirit of Vengeance. Man, I keep saying though that they publish a fair amount of Ghost Rider. Seems like Ghost Rider had a pretty good spell there. They were publishing a fair amount of Ghost Rider for a couple of years. Now they're not really doing much with Ghost Rider, but apparently they're starting something new with people whose names I don't recognize. The best hook for Ghost Rider that remains completely unacknowledged is bring back the actual real first Ghost Rider, who was a villain. We've just sort of accepted that the Ghost Rider is, a hero, because the heroic version, the Danny Ketch version, caught on. Even if it wasn't the John Blaze version. The John Blaze version, I guess that's supposed to be the John Blaze version. He was a villain. He wanted to murder people. He was constantly being held back by having to share his body with someone he hated. And that hasn't been a part of Ghost Rider for a while. It's more like the Hulk, similar to the Demon, but at the same time, it kind of had a unique place at Marvel, because the Ghost Rider, for his original run, John Blaze Ghost Rider, he was just some guy who could show up in any book in the line and just wreck you. He just comes through. He may not even be stronger than you. He may not have a reason to fight, but he's going to ruin your day if you meet him. That was the Ghost Rider's whole deal in the 1970s. And when he came back in the 90s, he was just a little bit more cuddly. It's like, it's all about vengeance and justice. It's like, no, man, you used to be all about terrorizing small children. Speaking of which, it's Jonathan Hickman. I don't know, man. I got a lot of loyalty to Greg Capullo, because he drew some of my very favorite comics of all time in Quasar. And he drew some very nice looking X-Force comics. I don't have a whole lot of... for some reason, even though I appreciated X-Force as a comic that people generally tended to put a fair amount of trouble into, because it sold pretty well, I appreciated it rather than really loving it. And it was like that in the Capullo era. His art is fantastic in it. It's worth flipping through just for that. It's also worth a read. But you could also go to your grave and, never crack the cover unless you're a real, Capullo diehard on them. And yes, I enjoy his Batman. I thought the first part of it, especially with the Joker's severed face business. Oh, so we're killing dinosaurs. Okay, I guess if you want to entice Greg Capullo back to Marvel, just give him Wolverine killing a velociraptor. Red blood on panel, and it's Nick Fury. Not that kid Nick Fury. No, it's the guy. He's currently. Is he still living on the moon? The problem is that people, I think, never took to the kid, because he was just given as a replacement for this guy who everyone recognized, even if they maybe didn't love him, they were used to him. And his kid in the books just couldn't have that same gravitas, because they saddled him with a terrible origin that completely undercut, And so he doesn't really fulfill the same place in the stories as the old Nick Fury, so they've had to use other characters. Well, so I guess they get other characters out of it. But at the same time, he's tied to World War II. Not a problem for Cap, or with the Winter Soldier, because they both have the super soldier serum running through their veins. So this is something to do with S.H.I.E.L.D. and Captain America's on board. So yeah, it looks, it's completely current, because it's, Jonathan Hickman, and pretty much Jonathan Hickman's default mode since he's been working at Marvel has been, that of the state of the art. The company puts, their biggest characters and their biggest stories safely in his hands. And he has even sometimes just set them right down and walked away. And they let him come back. Because he's got a really good track record. Straight up. I can bitch all I want about Jonathan Hickman not understanding the Avengers. And to the day I die, I will swear on a stack of Bibles, Jonathan Hickman didn't really write the Avengers. He wrote a bunch of characters in a book that was called Avengers, if you understand the difference. And yet for a whole generation, his were the definitive Avengers. And I find that just... I have a hard time living with that. In any event, it would be very difficult for me to conclude, even with all of that, that this does not have the juice, because, point of fact, this has the juice. I don't know if I'm going to go back and try to read the word balloons. I don't know. It is an open question to me whether or not I would enjoy the comic more if I tried to understand what it is about. I think that's personal growth right there. That insight, that was the key to the big bucks right there. So I guess Deadpool put a bomb in him and he has to claw it out of his own body with his claws. And then, so he gets blown up, has to rebuild himself from a pile of muck. And so, you know the drill. If Wolverine, ever gets, that hurt, his brain goes into a hard reset, and suddenly we're dealing with the most feral version of the character. So, yeah. It was fun. I don't know if I'm going to be around for issue 2. Simply because, I don't know, man, I don't like the vibe of the red band. It just, but it's still great Capullo. I think Greg Capullo knows how to draw really nice looking comic books. I have a copy of his Death Metal in soft cover. Is this going to go back on here? Maybe that's foolish trying to put that back on there. Okay. I don't like that the poly bags are back. It was bad enough when we were seeing them for, when they started doing the occasional full frontal nudity on a cover, so they put a poly bag on it. That at least I understand the common sense of. This, man, I don't know. Pretty soon it'll be Pogs. Pretty soon we'll be back to the Pogs. All right. I wanted to at least mention this thing. I've been looking forward to it for a little while because I saw Scott Kolins hyping it up on his social media. And I've been a fan of Scott Kolins for a while. If you want to see, I think, why Scott Kolins is, someone whom you maybe want to take a little bit of interest in, look at the Larfleeze series that he did for DC with Keith Giffen. It only lasted a year because all the will in the world wasn't going to get us more than 12 issues of Larfleeze at any point in the history of the Republic. But it's a glorious year of comics, if you ever happen to come across them in the back issue bins. And one of the reasons why they're as good as they are is this Scott Kolins fellow, who he seems like he had a little heat in first time in the early 2000s. He was someone, I want to say, was he on the Jeff Johns era of the Avengers? Which, my goodness, that is an age of the world that has long since passed right there. Jeff Johns writing the Avengers. And Scott Kolins is just, he's developed a really interesting trajectory. Look at this. My goodness, this is a nice looking comic. Who's giving us the colors on this? Scott Kolins is doing the colors here. He's not the only vet I've seen recently taking the bull by the horn, so to speak, with the colors. Since they moved to digital work. James Robinson doing the script. It's a long time since James Robinson has been a determining factor in me buying or not buying a comic book. He had a few sharp years back in the day. And never seemed quite able to pivot from that first success. Very interesting looking comic book, though. Old people talking. Not something every comic artist can make look interesting. This looks fun. Oh, that's a distinctive look right there. Everything looks like shonen now. Even the new stuff by people who were working in the 90s looks like, you know, more than a passing familiarity with the tropes of, you know, My Hero Academia. So yeah, this is a horror thing, where I guess there's this little girl who's, oh, is she being possessed by an evil mask? Oh, and I guess this other guy is being possessed by a mask too. Something like, I don't know. I suppose if I actually sat down, read the words. But I'm just flipping through it to bring it to your attention because it's an interesting looking comic book by an artist you may not be paying that much attention to. Oof. Well timed. Oh, that's... Has this been on the shelves? Colin Bunn, Andrea Muddy, Hassan Otsmani El How. I've said in the past, straight up, anything you see, Hassan Otsmani El How, put his name on, check it out. He has a good taste. A good taste of projects right there. I don't know if that's any good. More Grendel stuff. More The Goon. The Goon returns in a new series. I think there was another, like a Goon series or a one-shot recently on the shelves. I guess he's just back to doing the character. Never really panned out in a cartoon or a movie. I don't know. It seems like one of those ideas that maybe wouldn't be long for this world if you tried to take it out into another medium. I know no creator wants to hear that, but, you know. Grendel's another one. We may have dodged a bullet with that cartoon, I don't know. But it does seem to have led to a new appreciation of the original Grendel, which was not necessarily something that I would have, you know, bet the farm on as being inevitable, even just a few years ago. And yet they put the stuff back in print, and it seems like people picked it up. Nice looking covers on this. Morris on Otsmani El How. I'm going to talk myself into spending more money on comic books. No. Yeah, so if that looks like your cup of tea at all, that's a thing. Just an acknowledgement that G.I. Joe is still plugging along. Issue 309, which means this is the 9th month of, Image's new line of G.I. Joe comics. There's a whole line of G.I. Joe on the shelves now. And this book is kind of unusual for being... It would be hard to call it the flagship because it's not connected to the continuity of their new line at all. And yet, them getting the license had to have, underline, it had to come with, Larry Hama attached, because there were still people who bought the book through like 150 issues. 150 issues after Marvel. That's how loyal, in some very dire eras of the comics industry, no less. That's how loyal that audience is. And they announced as soon as they had the license, we're just going to let Larry write G.I. Joe. It'd be great if Larry could, retire off of G.I. Joe residuals, but that's not the world we live in. No. In the world we live in, the best I can do in the matter is take a stack off the pile of the G.I. Joe comics. He's still writing. Take it home. Probably enjoy them best in a huge pile at some point, because that's how Larry Hama stories tend to read. If you sit down and read one Larry Hama story on its own, it can sometimes be disappointing. But when you read a couple of years' worth of Larry Hama's stories in one sitting, you come away with a completely different understanding of the man's talent. You know, he wrote in long form. He wasn't writing for the trade. He was writing for the long box. And he still does. We're on issue 309. And, you know, I've spoken in the past about this book, how this book has a weirdly timeless quality because of a couple different issues. There's not just the fact that, you know, these characters, their specific origins in this version, Snake Eyes, and the core, you know, members of the first G.I. Joe team that everyone knows, you know, their origins are tied to Vietnam, just like the Punishers are. So I didn't read the last 150 issues close enough. You know, I peeked in and out a couple times just to make sure that, you know, the walls were still sturdy. And I don't know if he ever addressed the issues of the sliding time scale. Certainly, you know, what Marvel did with the Sian Kong War, that's just dreadful. That is absolutely dreadful. I'm sorry. I have a lot of respect for most of the people who were involved in those decisions. That ain't it. People aren't going to take to that. I don't think people are going to like that one. They're going to figure out other ways to work around it, because they do have to work around it. They have to work around it here. But I also think, you know, the second half of the Hama G.I. Joe, it has a bit of a hermetic quality because he's not playing catch up with the toy company anymore. And I'm sure that that's a more pleasant experience for him by orders of magnitude. And it certainly makes for a smoother reading experience when you don't have 12 new guys being introduced every 18 months and you have to make sure that there's always a new toy that has to be drawn into the book, and sometimes you have to set aside a whole issue to sell a space station play set, and you will never mention anything that happens in that issue at any other point, I don't think. But you will sell that space shuttle toy, and then you'll go right on back to doing what you were doing before they showed you the space shuttle toy. But that's also undeniably some of the energy in that series, and from the, you know, the Budiansky Transformers as well, is they're solid professionals who are having to dodge barrels professionally for a living. What are we going to do this month? We're going to introduce a character who is the product of the genetic material of all of history's greatest despots and generals into my G.I. Joe book. Well, okay, but I ain't touching Cobra Law. And I don't think he ever did touch Cobra Law. But I will point out, since, you know, he was so dainty about Cobra Law, like a third of his main cast right now is zombies. So, you know, I thought Cobra Law was like kind of cool when I was a kid. And then I went back and realized, oh, Larry Hama, he didn't have anything to do with it. He didn't touch it. And apparently, you know, they let him not touch it. And the Cobra Law stuff is all over some of the other G.I. Joe stuff that they brought back through Skybound. But, you know, it's still just Larry Hama doing his thing. Oh, what is this? This isn't G.I. Joe. It's an ad for something. What are they trying to sell me? Oh, what is this? I've seen art from this. Ultra Mega. Those are very nice looking bits of art there. Dave Stewart. And this is what the inside of the comic looks like. Well, that's not terrible. The passing Steve Rude. You know, some of the more, you know, physical comedy parts of Nexus with all the different funny-looking aliens. So yes, at some point I'll go back and I'll read. I intend, to go back and do the whole series because I need to read the second 150. I haven't read but a few of those comics intermittently. But yeah, the odd thing is that of all the comics that have ever been printed, G.I. Joe by Larry Hama is in the upper echelon of rereadability. Who knew? I certainly didn't when I was, the age to be excited by G.I. Joe, but also to have parents who forbid G.I. Joe coming in the house. And just real quick, to follow up from last week when we looked at the first appearance in continuity of the black costume, Marvel has been doing facsimiles of the original black costume saga of Amazing Spider-Man concurrent with the run of their facsimiles for the Secret Wars. And because I'm a sucker who already had that material, but didn't have this material in the original, I had the run in Marvel Tales that they did, like 6 or 7 years later. They ended up doing that. This is one of the better runs of Amazing Spider-Man from this period in the book's history. We've already read some of this on the sister channel, What's a Tegan Storage Locker. We read the two-parter with Firelord, which is still, one of the better regarded, two-parters from this part of the character's history. Perfectly decent, high-level Bronze Age stuff. Not top-shelf DeFalco Frenz. That would be the Thor that they did with Joe Sinnott. But if you're a fan of that team, seeing the development, this is certainly some very readable comics. And some interesting things happen in this period. This is, they're still flogging the Hobgoblin, even though by 259, the bloom was off the rose of the Hobgoblin. People were starting to figure out that they didn't have an ending for the Hobgoblin. And that, that was deadly. Once people figured out that they were vamping, it was just like the Clone Saga 10 years later. But anyway, just the reason I'm showing you this is because they've been doing every month both the Secret Wars and the Amazing Spider-Man from that original month together. And the same month that Secret Wars debuted the black costume, Amazing Spider-Man was already getting juice out of The Original Is Back. Now, the black costume wasn't going to be immediately forgotten. It wouldn't actually be gotten rid of out of Spider-Man's wardrobe for another couple years. He would go back and use it intermittently alongside the traditional red and blue, which people threw a hissy fit when they stopped using it for like a couple months. And now, of course, they give Spider-Man a new costume every other month, and it sucks. Everyone hates it. It's terrible. There's no juice to be found in changing Spider-Man's costume at all. None whatsoever. The juice is in actually keeping him in one costume for more than like 12 issues at a stretch, which didn't used to be such a big huff for Spider-Man. Because, like I say, they rushed to reassure people. Like, oh yeah, okay, we're not getting rid of that costume. We'll keep this other new one around because we think it looks kind of cool, but we're going to try and assuage your fears that we would ever try to get rid of, the real costume. People got really squirrely about that. Because, Spider-Man and his amazing friends was still on first-run TV. The Secret Wars wasn't necessarily a brand that had a lot of staying power, certainly next to the Superpowers line. But it was everywhere. They tried it for at least a year, so there was a fair amount of Secret Wars stuff with Spider-Man on it. Straight up, pound for pound, these toys sucked. They just did. They were going up against the Superpowers line, which was a very nice looking line of comic book accurate toys. And if what you're positing is that these characters are popular enough to support, a mainstream toy line, then have the the decency to give us the actual costumes that you think we recognize. That was the brilliance of the Superpowers toys. And I think that was kind of, where the Secret Wars stumbled, because, Dr. Doom had to use this costume variant. We were just talking about, the toys throwing at things. Well, Secret Wars was designed to sell toys, no doubt about it. I think it was kind of a miracle, interesting series, for some very different ways than maybe it was intended. But straight up, it's just a fun series to read. And one of it is because, they're trying to introduce kids to toys that they might buy, which is an interesting vibe for a Marvel comic still by 1984. We'd get used to it, though. Trust me. Trust me on that one. We'd get used to it. So, yeah, they make a big deal out of it. Not this time. And, like I say, first year or so of the Hobgoblin, man, that's good. Good stuff. And then straight up, in hindsight, Chris Claremont, he gets all the grief for, the stories that never end and don't have any endings. But straight up, Hobgoblin, this started in like 84, I think, and it just piddled out. They had something hot, and I think they didn't even know how hot it was going to be when they started, because they didn't really, that's not true. They had an ending. It wouldn't have been a very satisfying ending, but it would have been better than what they gave us, which was just decades of mess that can stand up, to the best of the 90s X-Men. The Hobgoblin mess, is its own chapter in history right next to the Clone Saga. We're not going to do the whole bullpen bulletins, just pointing out that this was the month that Saul Brodsky died, which was important enough for them to, run Shooter's obituary alongside the hype box. But they actually put him on the cover of Marvel Age that month. So he was someone behind the scenes who was recognized as a really integral part of the Marvel organism through the most important parts of its development. One of those founding fathers that maybe doesn't get as much play, because I don't think he ever drew a comic book in his entire life. But he was the production manager for a lot of years of the company's history. So yeah, just pointing out to accentuate the point I made briefly. Man, Frogger. Do the kids remember Frogger? Is there Frogger lore? Do we know this guy's name even? They never tried for a cartoon with Frogger, I don't think. Or maybe they did. I don't know. Maybe during the .com bust they brought Frogger back. That seems like something that might have happened. Anyway, I'm doing new videos, periodically at least, where I look at new books called Tegan Reads a Book. I did the first one a little bit ago on the first volume of Fist of the North Star. I had a lot of fun doing it. I'm probably going to do another at some point here pretty soon. I also put up videos where I talk about old comics, but you've probably seen those since they actually get better numbers than the new comics do. What else? Oh yes, this thing. I know you're going to get sick of hearing me talk about this, but I want you to go buy it because I haven't been in the print journal for a while. I'm proud of the essay I did here with the help of the fine editors, Gary Groth, Austin English, Christy Valenti, who I worked with, and they helped me write an essay on Daniel Clowes that turned out pretty darn good. And there's 9 other excellent pieces of writing here by 9 other excellent writers about 9 other excellent comics. Please, go get it. Check out my aforementioned daily TikTok videos. They're on Instagram too. A new comic book every single day until I get sick of doing it. That's literally it, folks. Until I'm bored doing it, which will, I promise you, it will come. At some point, I will get bored of doing them. But I'm not bored of doing them anytime soon. I do a podcast with Claire Napier. It's called Udder Madness. We talk about Witchblade, The Darkness, Mark Silvestri, Michael Turner, all that good stuff. We just put up a bonus episode a little bit ago about the first episode of the brand new Witchblade. I just picked up the second issue of the brand new Witchblade. I think I'm going to go read it right now. What else? Oh yes, I should at some point have that review, that Godzilla piece up on the journal at some point. I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. I'm looking forward to passing on the links to you. Anyway, please have a wonderful day. The vibe? Low key? Vibe's kind of weird right now, so do your best to ride it out. Be kind to animals and small children. I always specify small children because big children can sass you, and you got to sass them right back, or they'll know you're afraid. What else? You know, I think that's enough. Have a wonderful day.